So welcome to this first debate in the Ethical Battles in Science and Medicine strand, which is supported by the Wellcome Trust. This session, you probably know, is entitled Born This Way. I'm Craig Fairlington. I'm Online Resources Manager at the Institute of Ideas. And this debate kind of came up for me last year when Cynthia Nixon, who was a star of Sex and the City, declared in an interview that she'd chosen to be a lesbian. That itself wasn't too interesting. What was interesting was the reaction. It caused a lot of outcry amongst kind of gay rights people in America. Now, the reason for that, I guess, is that actually for a lot of these people, sexuality not being a choice has kind of become a key plank in the fight for equal rights. Now, this is perhaps a kind of shift for what used to be true. The kind of first fights for gay rights were against the idea that homosexuality was an illness and was actually a choice that rational adults could make about how to live their lives. So I guess what we're kind of going to explore is, can sexuality be simply part of our brains? Is there something wider that creates gays? And can actually gay rights only be secure if being gay is natural, or do we actually have to think about a political situation in which it becomes irrelevant? So the speakers I have with me to explore that, on my left, Dr Ceri Parsons, who's a senior lecturer in psychology at Staffordshire University. Her research interests include gender identity and sexuality. On my right, we have Wes Streeton, who's a head of education at Stonewall, and he's a former president of NUS, National Union of Students. So in conversations, I'll just kind of launch it open. Ceri, do you think sexuality can just be found in the brain? Are people just born that way?
No, that's not the perspective that I would take at all. And for me, I suppose that question of whether you're born that way or this way is a bit anachronistic, really. It's almost, if we keep asking this question, we're reinforcing the assumption that being gay is something that needs explaining. So, like Craig mentioned earlier about the old research, which or research which is assuming that homosexuality is an illness, if we continue to try and locate sexuality within the brain, we basically reduce our understanding of sexuality broadly and make something that is very intricate and very detailed and meaningful far less meaningful. So from my point of view, I wouldn't go down that line.
But, of course, there seems to be a lot of evidence that actually, not just anecdotal reported from gay people's lives, but also from brain scans that seem to suggest that there is a kind of physical difference between homosexuals, bisexuals, straight people.
There is an investment in exploring things and trying to get to an understanding through science, as if science is somehow taking us towards a position of ultimate, emancipation. We get the ultimate truth, and that, that's a good thing. And it's not to deny that there's good research that's going on, but we have to be aware that science is done not in a vacuum. There are many social factors and investments by, the researchers, assumptions of society, the investors who do the research, to take us to a particular point. And so actually, there are pieces of research that get done in science. If so often you find the results don't jar with the zeitgeist, they tend to not get publicised so well. So I would say there's lots of different ways of looking at things, and I think we can challenge that.
So as you noticed, we're joined with Dr Qazi Rahman, who's a lecturer in psychological sciences and director of the psychology programmes at Queen Mary University. He's co-director for Centre for Mind and Society, and he's the co-author of a book, Born Gay. Glad you could join us. I just asked Ceri, are people born gay? What would your position on that be?
Firstly, apologies for being late. It's what happens when you go out on a Saturday night and you have a 9:30 on a Sunday. I often get asked this question: are you born gay or not? It's a false dichotomy. Everyone is born something insofar as all our behaviour is due to biological factors. So the question about whether you're born something is somewhat irrelevant for people who take a strongly biological view of psychological phenomena. So I would say, yes, you're born gay or straight insofar as you're born anything, really. The interesting question for psychologists is what kinds of mechanisms, be they learning-based or based in genetics or in hormones, wire the brain in a particular kind of way which delivers a particular kind of trait. In this case, whether you're attracted towards people of the same sex or the opposite sex. So I think that the fundamental philosophical point to take is all your behaviour is biologically based. While you're here listening to us all here, that's a biologically based behaviour insofar as it's generated and takes place in your brain. So I think to generate particular kinds of social policy and political implications from a subset of biologically based behaviours doesn't make a great deal of sense. The way I tend to think about the social justice and political elements of this research in terms of sexual orientation is to say, if we accept the science that shows that all the old defunct learning theories and ideas about choice no longer apply in the case of sexual orientation, then after that point, there's very little else that the science can tell us. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, it does. Ceri, I think you've got something much to say.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we are biological beings, but as human beings, our behaviour takes place in a social context and a political context. And I was thinking when you were talking there about, either being born gay or being born straight, and say, for example, people who identify as bisexual, people who identify as asexual, perhaps, that they're making some kind of choice in terms of how they behave sexually. So it's almost like there's some kind of biological imperative that then overrides our social context, and we're just going for it either as gay people or straight people. And I don't think we can take away the historical, social, cultural, political context.
I think we agree more on things than we disagree. So in terms of whether there are historical, political or cultural inputs into behaviour, yes. And when we talk about things like choice, and you will have heard the recent discussions from people who call themselves behavioural economists, who talk about things like choice in the economic context and the way that we don't do choice very, very well. The human mind is full of all kinds of tricks it plays on us and all kinds of biases, which is apparently supposed to explain the economic crisis. Of course, those sorts of things, there are social, historical, environmental inputs into those sorts of behaviours. What I'm saying in terms of the research on sexual orientation is those social factors, those choice factors, don't affect the direction of your sexual preference. So when we take sexual orientation as a unique trait, and I think sexual orientation is unique among the human definitional attributes like sex and ethnicity, then I think in that case, the research strongly shows that sexual orientation is something that is reasonably hardwired early in development and into the brain. When it comes to other kinds of things, like whether you choose to eat chocolate cake or not, of course those things are choices, even though they're constrained by biology, it's food after all, those are choices that are influenced by the kinds of inputs that I think Ceri is talking about. Psychologists call those sorts of things proximate mechanisms. Those are the things that deliver behaviour, be they social factors or biological factors. It's a standard sort of first-year psychology thing you teach students. And then you have ultimate explanations, which are the why for behaviour. I think once we think in those ways, we get out of this dichotomy between choice and nurture on the one hand, and biology and something hardwired on the other.
Yeah, so I kind of want to bring Wes in. So you work in kind of gay rights campaigning. Why do you think that this kind of born this way thing seems so important for a lot of gay campaigners? Why were so many people in America outraged by Cynthia Nixon's innocuous comment, really?
What I thought was interesting about her use of the word choice is that people are often making choices around sexual orientation, and the choice is often to deny your own identity and your own sexuality for fear of prejudice and because of the way that society over throughout history has demonised gay people and homosexuality as something that's wrong and unnatural, and that this isn't historical prejudice. Only a week or so ago, the former Archbishop of Canterbury likened gay marriage, equal marriage campaigners to Nazis, forgetting, of course, that gay people were amongst the victims of fascism. And only the other day we saw our own homegrown fascists in Britain publishing information about the whereabouts of a gay couple that had the temerity to suggest that bed and breakfast owners couldn't discriminate on people on grounds of sexual orientation. I think ultimately this debate is interesting, but it it's a distraction. If you're looking for the nature and nurture debate, and you're looking to nature in particular as a panacea for prejudice and as the kind of the silver bullet that's going to deliver equal rights for gay people, I think you're on a hiding to nothing really, because if you identify genetic factors and identify the gay gene, people simply argue that it's another genetic defect, and it raises the possibility of genetic screening or a gay cure in biological terms. If it's nurture, then it reinforces what many people already believe, which is why you have these hideous gay cure conferences, which is about trying to alter your behaviour. I think maybe the word we're looking for is natural. Gay people are often accused of being unnatural because it's a way of dehumanising gay people and a way of suggesting that the simple reality of being gay is something that people shouldn't embrace and shouldn't celebrate really. And I think maybe when Cynthia Nixon used the word choice, maybe it wasn't that she suddenly woke up one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to be a lesbian." I think that's kind of fashionable and cool. I think it's more the case that we are brought up in a society. Same for me. I didn't come out till I was at university because I desperately tried not to be gay. I thought it would ruin my life, it would ruin my career, and it's something that just wasn't the right thing to be. So maybe when we talk about choice, it's simply choosing not to be defined by others, to actually embrace ourselves and our own identity, and to be as nature intended. I think whether you take the arguments of Ceri or Qazi, I think ultimately we're talking about something which is natural, which has always existed and will continue to exist. And to quote the bus campaign, "Some people are gay, some people are bi. Get over it."
I agree entirely, but I think within what you've said, you've sort of the words were interesting. So you mentioned the word natural. I mean, as soon as you start using that kind of terminology, then you're in the realm of biology. When you start talking about or making statements about immutability, that things are determined, then you're talking about biology again. So I think, whilst I think at some level, I agree that the debate between Ceri's camp and mine is somewhat irrelevant. I think in certain areas it has been relevant in the past. So, for example, when the science of sexual orientation shows that you can't learn to be gay, you can't choose to be gay, and that teachers can't do anything to you to make you be gay, then that suddenly makes certain laws like Clause 20 absolutely ridiculous. Winning things like gay adoption rights, there's a current debate about marriage, which I think is interesting, is partly on the immutability criterion, which comes from biology, just as it has been for women in the past and for ethnic minorities and other groups that are defined in part by their biology. So I think it matters for at least half of the time. I think the issue is, and I have no answers to this, is where you slice that up. At which point does it become less relevant, and at which point does it? In the case of the gay marriage debate, perhaps that's one area where it becomes less relevant, perhaps.
I think, going back, sorry, it just kind of incorporates both what you're saying, going back to the point you were saying about choice, and maybe it was a choice just to come out. From my point of view, and I identify as a lesbian, I do think it was a choice, and I felt very strongly for a large portion of my growing up life that I was heterosexual, and I met somebody, and I had a same-sex relationship, and then since then, I've been in same-sex relationships. Now, I always take the perspective that could again change in the future. Not that I hope it's going, because my partner's sitting at the front. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen, but it could do. And when you look at some qualitative research, because Qazi's work is very much experimental, and the work that I do as a psychologist is more qualitative in nature. When you look at research that looks at people and lesbians' discussions, for example, of their understanding of being lesbian, it's often quite variable, and the sort of subjective experience that comes out is not one of, I know this is how things are, although some people will say that. Other people will talk about it maybe as a choice more, or, things could change, or, I think, so yeah.
Do you think that people, do you think people choose who to be attracted to? Because I kind of think that, when you find someone attractive, you're not kind of, there's no effort involved. You just find them attractive, and that can be a range of facts. That could be their physical appearance, their personality. It's interesting in this kind of realm of choice, and you were talking about being attracted to people of the opposite sex, as you were growing up. I mean, I think sometimes the kind of debate about sexuality is too often dominated by gay people and straight people, and of course there are a whole category of people who are bisexual who are often overlooked, and lots of people who see, their sexual orientation, as more of a spectrum rather than, a binary divide. So,
and I think there's this cultural thing, because I was just thinking about, because I'm a discourse analyst, so I'm interested in language, thinking about the words that we use, and we've got these categories of gay, straight, and bisexual, and there's often this construction of bisexuals as basically not being able to make up their minds and having their cake and eating it, and wanting it every way. That actually is a kind of negative construction. That we seem to have this strong push to want to pin people into a binary in some way, and I think that makes it hard for bisexuals. But I would go definitely down the line that things are more variable, and that we don't just slot into two discrete categories in that way.
I'm interested in kind of what you're talking about there, Wes, and when you said earlier about not wanting to allow people to define you, do you not think by trying to make grounds of homosexuality being natural, actually you're allowing opponents to create the definition that things that are unnatural are somehow wrong or unhealthy, immoral? Isn't it better to kind of actually say that actually the category of natural unnatural has no kind of real basis when we're talking about these kind of moral arguments?
Maybe, and you kind of stumped me on that one. Yeah. I think it's interesting because there is a whole broader debate. I think what I'm often struck by is you mentioned I used to be president of NUS. What I found really interesting going to NUS LGBT conferences over the years was particularly amongst new generations of younger people coming through that campaign, people in terms of the liberation politics were less and less comfortable with even terms like lesbian, gay, bisexual. Notions of kind of any gender binary as well, and I think that if you ask those people, then they would definitely resent the idea that you couch gay rights in terms of nature and being natural. It is about freedom fundamentally, and not allowing others to kind of define where you come from. I think the point I'm making is that this is a phenomenon that's existed throughout history, and I don't accept necessarily that people are making a choice of any kind when it comes to their sexuality. When it comes to attraction and who you're attracted to, I think this is something that that same-sex attraction is something that does occur naturally. It's part of humanity, and that's why it's interesting when Hillary Clinton made her speech at the United Nations earlier this year, that we are couching gay rights firmly within human rights, and a common understanding about what it means to be human, and what it means to have equal rights and opportunities. And I think that's the right direction.
I'll open it out to the floor. So, have anyone got any questions?
I'm amazed that all three speakers seem to have very, very strong prejudices and not very interested in changing them. But a bit of evidence, I was interested in Ceri Parsons' comments that she was heterosexual, apparently, and then decided, or was attracted to somebody who was same-sex. I'd like to know how big that category is, because that seems the most interesting remark I've heard today. Because if that happens even once, but if it happens reasonably often, this raises very interesting questions of where you locate sexuality. I accept the arguments about not being defined by other people. There's an anti-slavery position, basically, which I agree with. But nevertheless, that seems to be very interesting, because then it does raise questions. We're told, it's inborn, nothing else you can do about it, we're told. But where's the evidence for these amazing assertions? Jump to these things. And I thought your remark was interesting. I'd like to know more about it.
I was perturbed by Dr. Rahman's comment that all behaviour is biologically based. I've never thought that human life and human culture is biologically circumscribed. I mean, obviously, biology is a necessary precondition for our existence, but I always thought it was an insufficient condition, and that everything we do transcends our biological origins, which define us perhaps as individuals, but not as a collective, and the dynamics that flow between us. So I was perturbed by that, but I found it very interesting. I'm chairing a debate later in this strand on epigenetics, fascinating area. But an interesting thing about epigenetics in relation to the subject of this debate is the overwhelming relief that some people had when they learned about epigenetics and they realised that it could furnish a potential biological explanation for identical twins of differing sexual orientations who had an identical genome and very similar upbringing. And it made me a little sad, to be honest, because the overwhelming hunger for a biological explanation for the differing sexual orientation of identical twins and the overwhelming relief when epigenetics seemed to present such an explanation just seemed to me to indicate that there's a kind of blind spot. In some way we are blind to things that lie out with the categories of biology and environment that relate directly to human life and human culture. That might account for our sexual orientation, and that might account for differing sexual orientation even in the case of identical twins. So have we got a big blind spot here is my question.
Thank you. I'll come out for another round of questions. I want to give the panel a chance. I'm interested, actually, in things like Section 28, there seems to be a kind of assumption, actually, that there would be something bad if you could convince a teenager to be gay. So I'm just kind of throwing that out. Is there anything you want to kind of respond to?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if tomorrow I was proved wrong and I was out of a job and sexual orientation was entirely due to environments, epigenetics, choice, and, whether the weather changed or not, it would make no difference to, in my view, whether gay people should have the full range of rights. It's a kind of, in some ways, Wes's point is right, it is irrelevant. But we don't live in that world. Sexual orientation has a biological component. Laws like Clause 28, some of these other things, the reason why they don't exist anymore is because of the immutability criterion. What I said earlier was that stops at a certain point. In the case of gay marriage, maybe the debate needs to be in the social arena rather than the biological one.
I think we have rights as well because of the campaigning of groups of people. So, for example, if we take the category homosexuality, which was in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual up until around 1973-74, that got removed. Now, that didn't just get removed because one day homosexuality was an illness and then the next day it wasn't. That we have to remember that was because there were a group of people going out campaigning and getting rights by being politically active. So again, for me, it's always considering that thing, too, is very, very important.
I mean, self-denial is a very powerful thing, and I think that we are, certainly I felt as I was growing up, constantly bombarded by messages, images, essentially bullying behaviour, both overt homophobic bullying, but also, bullying behaviour in terms of, telling people that, same-sex attraction is wrong, living with someone, falling in love with someone of the same sex is wrong, and I think that's partly why people do end up in this trap of spending their whole lives in some cases married to someone that I think they would consider to be close friends. I think you can't be married to someone for years unless you have a really miserable marriage, being trapped in that position. But they spend years married to someone who they consider their friend, but have never been attracted to because of the way society has punished them. And I think that's why mental ill health amongst lesbian and gay and bisexual people is much higher than the rest of the population, because people constantly grow up wrestling with these problems. 1 in 4 gay young people at some point attempt suicide, more than half self-harm, which is why I find it unbelievable. It's interesting you mentioned Section 28. There are still people today, when we are doing work in schools, in primary schools and secondary schools, which has nothing to do with teaching people to be gay. It's not as if Stonewall's rocking up with a range of resources on how to be gay. It's ridiculous. What it is about, though, is equipping children of today to grow up in 21st century Britain, where homosexuality and same-sex relationships are a reality. They will always be a reality, and we've got to bring people up in a society where we respect each other, where we respect difference. I hate the word tolerance. I think it is about respect and respecting others. And ensuring that as they make their way through life that they can do so in a way that doesn't hold them back through bigoted behaviour. Because, thankfully in 21st century Britain, if you're a bigot at work and you are bullying people on grounds of sexual orientation or hiring and firing people on grounds, that's illegal. You will be punished, and rightly so. And we've got to start, educating people that, in order for their children to be successful in Britain, you have to accept and respect same-sex relationships. No, of course we're not victims inherently, but I think many gay people, and particularly young people, are victims of prejudiced behaviour. That's the problem we're trying to tackle. And, you know, and certainly I think when you look at the seriousness of some of the effects of homophobic bullying, simply, you know, telling kids to man up is not the right approach.
Just to say, kind of looking to history and culture again and thinking about constructions of kind of permissible female behaviour, permissible male behaviour. The whole notion of male homosexuality became criminalised at a certain point, and just anecdotally, like Queen Victoria didn't even believe lesbianism existed. That's why there was this, you know, that was never criminalised. So I kind of think there have been barriers to certain forms of behaviour because they have been recognised and criminalised as opposed to not, as the case may be. But that's just a very, very tiny little thing that, you know, I would just say in relation to that, maybe, but I'm trying to be very brief.
Two quick points. One, also to follow up the gender difference. I think that explains some of the confusion we have. The scientists in the area accept that there's a strong sex difference in the presentation of human sexual orientation. So women have what we call a non-category specific sexual orientation, which means what they say and how their bodies respond are very, very different. And so we've been making errors. Scientists need to ask women about their sexuality in very, very different ways to what we would do with men. Men have category-specific sexuality, meaning they tend to be either or. And I think some of the issues about what causes those differences is an interesting one, and we don't have the answers yet. I just do want to pick up, though, one really important point that I think everyone is making, particularly Wes, about LGBT mental health. I'm moving my research into more LGBT mental health work, and I think policy and research in this area matters absolutely. There's one American study which has just come out. It's absolutely fascinating. And what they've discovered is that in the 12 months after legislation for same-sex marriage, gay men had better health outcomes and lower health costs than in the 12 months before that legislation was introduced. If we look at US states which have legalized same-sex marriage, gay people have better health outcomes than in those states where there isn't legalised same-sex marriage. So the science in this area matters, the policy matters, and the debate matters too.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to end it there. So can we thank our panel, please?